I think if you're going around wanting to ruin other people's enjoyment at literary festivals and to ruin or to threaten the survival of some of these festivals, talking all this talk, you should do a little bit of walking some of the walk yourself.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Sam Leith, the literary editor of The Spectator. In the last 10 days or so, half a dozen literary festivals have parted way from their main sponsor, the investment fund Baillie Gifford. It started with Hay, and then Edinburgh. We've had the Borders, Wigtown, Cheltenham, and just very recently we heard that the Stratford Festival in the East End of London has parted way with Baillie Gifford, all at the behest of a collection of campaigners, or book workers as they call themselves, who insist that any association with Baillie Gifford, who is invested in some ways in fossil fuels and in Israel, needs to end. So Alex Massie joins me now. Alex has written about this. What do you think this means, and what do you think it's the effect it's going to have going forward now?
Well, there are a couple of things to be said there, Sam. I mean, first, I think it means that it is going to be extraordinarily difficult for literary festivals across the United Kingdom, but perhaps particularly in Scotland, where Baillie Gifford is headquartered in Edinburgh and devotes a really significant amount of funding to book festivals and the arts more generally in Scotland. It's going to be very difficult for all of these festivals, I think, to replace the funding that they've received historically from Baillie Gifford, because what kind of company is going to be interested in supporting literary festivals in this way, conscious that there is the potential for significant disruption, significant protest as a result of doing so? And what sort of company that would be willing to invest money supporting literature and be acceptable to the people mounting these protests which I would suggest are idiotic, asinine, ludicrous, absurd, completely preposterous, and based on a profound ignorance, not just of what Baillie Gifford actually does, but the way the world bloody works. And there is an extraordinary amount of humbug and hypocrisy here as well. The objections made to Baillie Gifford, who are a long-standing supporter of the arts and generally considered by people in arts organisations to be ideal sponsors, in as much as they make no demands whatsoever. They ask for nothing really in return, save for the opportunity to have their name associated with the event.
Well, last year, didn't they, the Baillie Gifford Prize, which is the leading non-fiction prize in the country and bears their name, was given to a book about the environmental catastrophe, fire weather. And so they're clearly not they're not tipping the scales in terms of content, are they?
No, and, as I say, I mean, you have to start asking, well, what sort of organisation would be deemed an acceptable sponsor? Because, the objections to Baillie Gifford are that they have a small amount of money, relatively speaking, invested in companies that are linked to fossil fuels. Now, that linkage is itself interesting. So, for instance, if you had a company, an energy company, that was producing 80% of its power from renewable sources, but 20% from oil and gas, that would be considered a fossil fuel company by these protesters. So there's the sort of fossil fuel side of things, and then there is, which has been rumbling for a while. I mean, Greta Thunberg cancelled an appearance at the Edinburgh Book Festival last year because she objected to Baillie Gifford having about 2% of its £230 billion of funds under management invested in companies that could in some sense be said to be linked to oil and gas. So this has been rumbling for a while, and then this year, that hadn't made enough of an impact. So the additional thing was linked to it, which was Israel, and so Baillie Gifford is accused of having investments in companies that are in some way or another linked to Israel and the Israeli military and so on. Now, when you drill down into it and you look at what fossil fuels are complaining about and who the companies are that they list here and demand that Baillie Gifford divest from, these include Amazon, the chipmaker Nvidia. It includes Facebook, or Meta, as it's now known, which also owns Instagram, upon which platform Fossil-Free Books relies an awful lot for their organisation and spreading their word, which is an interesting thing in itself. And so it is really a demand that Baillie Gifford divest itself from the internet, effectively, which is, I think, impossible to do. Every single person who owns a tracker fund as part of their pension, and most people will own these funds whether they know it or not, because of the way pensions are invested, is themselves invested in all of these companies. So, it is a ludicrous demand that is actually impossible to fulfill, even if Baillie Gifford were willing to do so.
Also, we should make the point that Baillie Gifford, it's not entirely in their gift to do so, because they manage funds on behalf of clients who are allowed to make their own ethical decisions, isn't it? It's not, their business model is a very standard one in the industry where, within the law, they invest in what their clients want them to invest in.
Absolutely. If you're a company, say, running an investment trust and so on, you give your fund manager a mandate saying that this is what we want to do. Your responsibility is to deliver it within the parameters we've set. And this is, again, a misconception I think that many of these campaigners and protesters have. Baillie Gifford doesn't have any money itself. No investment house has money of its own. It is other people's money that they manage. And so you're quite right, I think, to point out the importance of those mandates. And there is a further irony, obviously, in this specific case, because in the financial world, what Baillie Gifford is actually most famous for is taking early bets, early investments on private firms that are often in the tech and green sectors. They were an early investor, for instance, in Tesla, most famously. For a long time, Baillie Gifford, or the funds managed by Baillie Gifford, were the second largest shareholder in Tesla after Elon Musk himself. And that's a company that has clearly done more to accelerate the demise of the internal combustion engine than pretty much any other company. And comparably, Baillie Gifford are one of the largest investors. They've invested more than £500 million in a Swedish company called Northvolt, which aims to become Europe's leading manufacturer of electric batteries for electric vehicles. So I think you could argue that Baillie Gifford is actually doing exactly what we want capital markets to do, which is finding and funding innovative companies that are aspiring to solve long-term and challenging problems, and many of these are climate change related. And so in that sense, the company is actually doing a lot of what these idiot protesters demand it do. But because they are enthralled to a sort of radical anti-capitalist agenda, they refuse to see this or cannot see.
Well, do you think that's the root of it? That it's the resistance is not to a particular allocation of these funds, but is it to the idea of investment capital in the first place? Is that your reading of the agenda?
I think so fundamentally, because if last year it was just fossil fuels. This year it's fossil fuels and Israel. Next year it'll be fossil fuels, Israel, and something else. There isn't any way, I think, of pacifying these people. And I think, it's important to remember as well that they are thundering hypocrites. Waterstones, Britain's biggest bookshop, and indeed Barnes & Noble in the United States, are both owned by hedge funds. The hedge fund Elliott Advisor
very heavily invested
owns Waterstones, and it is a very active player in oil and gas markets. And yet I do not see Frankie Boyle and Sally Rooney and other people who've signed letters protesting about Baillie Gifford. I do not see them saying that it is intolerable for Waterstones to continue to sell their books, in the same way as I do not see them withdrawing their books for sale from from Amazon, a company to which they also object. And I'm not sure. I think if you're going around wanting to ruin other people's enjoyment at literary festivals and to ruin or to threaten the survival of some of these festivals, I don't think it's asking too much to say that if you're talking all this talk, you should do a little bit of walking some of the walk yourself.
Well, in terms of the walk they have walked, what I'm trying to sort of put from their point of view, they would say, I think, that they weren't calling on these festivals to part ways with Baillie Gifford. They were hoping, and we might accept the premise that some form of consumer boycott of action on moral grounds is a legitimate way to attempt to change the world. They would say what they were hoping was that the festivals would pressure Baillie Gifford through their association to divest. Was that a fool's errand?
Well, yes, quite clearly. I mean, I live in Edinburgh. I actually know quite a number of people who work at Baillie Gifford. Baillie Gifford is not going to be dictated to, and no investment house could afford to be dictated to, by a bunch of people making ludicrous demands of this sort. There's a great deal of sadness within the company, I think, at senior levels within the partnership that runs the company, that its association with many of these literary festivals, some of which goes back, a couple of decades now, is coming to an end.
We should say that's actually that appears to be now Baillie Gifford themselves are saying actually we're having nothing more to do with it. Cheltenham, I think, actually wants to keep them on.
What's in it for them? At the moment they're being traduced by a bunch of know-nothing yahoos, it's more trouble than it's worth. The support they give to literary festivals is vital for those festivals, but it's not terribly vital for Baillie Gifford itself. And so when push comes to shove, if it's more trouble than it's worth, then with a great deal of sadness and a certain amount of reluctance and so on, they accept that, well, okay, fine, it's not for us, but we cannot be dictated to by people who know absolutely nothing about our business. Because, even if Baillie Gifford were to sell stocks in publicly traded companies, for instance, somebody else is going to buy those Facebook shares, those Amazon shares, those Nvidia shares, and so on. It's not going to alter the way Amazon goes about its business. But, it doesn't change anything. As I say, the interesting thing about Baillie Gifford and other investment houses, Goldman Sachs and so on and others and so on, is the investment in private early stage or private or newly public companies and so on that are raising capital to develop the products, the solutions, the innovations and so on that will address many of the climate change issues that
true, isn't it, that if you're
quite reasonably worry about. But you have to businesses that are trying to develop carbon capture or carbon neutral molecules for making products that previously been made by fossil fuels. All of that requires a significant amount of capital. It costs money. That has to come from somewhere, and it can only really come from private capital markets, which is how we should want them to operate.
Is it not also the case, though, that it's exactly the companies that are associated with fossil fuels, i.e. the energy companies, that are the ones that are best placed and most likely to manage whatever transition to a green future we're going to have?
Well, quite often that's going to be the case, clearly, and this is a long-term process as well. Even something like, every book you buy is at a certain level made from oil. The bleach that's required, making paper is a very energy-intensive process. The bleach that's required to whiten the pages and so on, so you can actually read them, is a petrochemical product. So is the ink that is printed into books. So is the glue that holds them together. As I say, at a certain point, books are made from oil. Now, that may change in time, but we're not there yet. And this sort of mad rush to try and, sort of cancel companies or to try and pretend that we can have a fossil-free world right now is just deluded. A just transition, fine, but transition, is a term that implies this is something that is going to take quite a long time. It's not an overnight thing.
I think there's also, in terms of the effects, we can talk about the hypocrisy of the Spectators, but in terms of the effects on it seems an irony that, this is a campaign that's roughly coming from the left, but its net effect on the festivals is that if they're losing sponsors, those of them that survive at all will have to put up their ticket prices, so access will be more restricted to the wealthy. But also, which has not been very much discussed, there are tens of thousands of school children who, most of them underprivileged school children, who get a benefit from these festivals, don't they? They use the tents during the daytime for events with children, for creative writing, for all sorts of, kind of spin-off and diffusion line material from the festivals, and that's going to go by the board as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly at Edinburgh and the Borders Book Festival, which are the two I know best, Baillie Gifford basically pay for the entire children's programme. And they fund an awful lot of free books that are given out. And they do this, yes, it's good for their brand, I suppose, but it doesn't bring them in any particular, business, I think. Their main clients in the UK are local authority pension funds, who are not probably going to be saying, well, I'm going to invest in Baillie Gifford because they do excellent, excellent things for children, giving children free books and creative writing classes, No, I mean, they invest these funds because they think they'll receive a return. But that return, obviously, pays for the old age of local government employees, school janitors and so on. So those, to some extent, are the people who are hurt by some of these protests and boycotts too. But you're absolutely right. Children's programs in particular are going to be a very easy thing for literary festivals to cut. Because they don't bring in any money. And when there is less money to go around, less money to support these festivals, that is clearly, an easy place to start.
Yeah. Widening the scope a little bit, some people have said, among them our own Martin van der Weer, this is it, not just for literary festivals, for art sponsorship in this country, if that's the way it goes. Do you subscribe to that view, or is that hysterical?
Well, I mean, there may be people who come forward and sort of say, no, actually, I'm happy to take the risk and so on. There may be large sources of funds that are deemed, morally irreproachable. But it's quite difficult to see exactly where they would come from, because it's anything connected with financial services or, financial products of one sort or another would now appear to be tainted. It has already been decided by many arts organisations that say defence companies are illegitimate sources of funds, which I think is remarkable.
One of them owned Hachette for many years.
Well, yeah, and the idea that BAE Systems, which is a company crucial to the defence of the realm, is an unacceptable sponsor of, say, the Royal Opera House or the National Gallery or whatever and so on, or a book festival, strikes me as a preposterous thing to say. But nevertheless, that's where we are. So who would be acceptable? And why would you take the reputational risk now of being condemned for your wholly legitimate business practices? Because this is the thing, it's not like Baillie Gifford or other investment houses are doing anything illegal or even immoral, but yet they're traduced and their reputation is trashed, regardless. And so, yeah, why would you get involved? And consequently, I think there'll be, and we already see it from Edinburgh actually, increased demands for public support, for government money. But I think that is a very, very difficult case to make. Why on earth should the taxpayer further subsidise arts organisations that willingly turn down wholly respectable sources of private sponsorship?
Well, quite so. Do you think, out of interest, there are moral lines that can be drawn? You disagree very strongly, and I think we both disagree very strongly with where these protesters have drawn a moral line. But do you think there's ever a case where a festival or an arts organisation could say, we don't want your funding? I mean, maybe the Sacklers are a good idea. I mean,
the Sacklers, I think, as matters developed, I think you could see why that became problematic, because it wasn't just the way in which, the Sackler family with its opioid products in North America, it wasn't the discovery or the manufacturing of these products that was the problem with the Sacklers. It was the way they continued to push them to people, knowing the way, knowing what was going to happen, really, exacerbating an opioid crisis across the United States. So it wasn't the product itself, it was the way the company marketed it and pushed it to doctors who then pushed it to vulnerable people and so on, knowing full well what the likely outcome was going to be. And that was something where I think you could say for a pharmaceutical company, putting its profits above any kind of ethical or moral considerations and so on would perhaps call into question the appropriateness of them supporting, the National Gallery or whatever. Albeit, when they first began sponsoring, their philanthropic stuff to arts organisations, I think the calculation would have been rather different. But things do change over time. I mean, I can see that there are certain circumstances when you think that wouldn't be an appropriate source of sponsorship. But one of the key things in this argument is that, by the standards of financial houses, Baillie Gifford are actually doing the hard work of investing, hundreds of millions, billions of pounds in precisely the kind of early stage companies that are attempting to solve the problems of climate change through technology. And yes, they want a return on that in the long run, and many of these companies will fail, but some of them may prove to be a spectacular success. And so, one of the things that's enraging about this whole controversy isn't just the sort of standard complaints about capitalism. It's that in this particular case, by any objective standard, the protesters are targeting a company that is actually on their side in terms of some of their stated long-term objectives. So there's an unfairness as well as a stupidity to it that is really quite irksome.
Well, sometimes said, no good deed goes unpunished. Alex Massie, thank you very much.
No, thank you.